Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever really stopped to think about, the precise boundaries of your rights when law enforcement steps onto your private property? Not talking about a public street here, but right there in your own driveway, maybe your yard, your space. It's probably a scenario most people don't give much thought to until it's actually happening right in front of them. So today we're doing a deep dive into a pretty specific incident caught on video, actually. It involves a man in Longview, Texas. And this encounter with the police, it started right there in his own driveway. Our mission, really, is to dissect this interaction. We're going to draw on the legal analysis from our source material to really understand those critical differences between police interactions on private property versus, say, a public road. This isn't just some story. Think of it as a practical look at understanding your boundaries.
Yet what's really fascinating here, and our analysis makes this crystal clear, is just how much the rules, the expectations, they shift the second you're on private property. It's absolutely crucial, I think, to stress this right from the start. The kind of interaction we're about to explore and the legal points that come up, they are not recommended if you find yourself pulled over on a public road, any kind of public road. We're focusing, like laser focused, exclusively on situations that happen within the definite boundaries of your private property, your driveway, your yard. This deep dive is all about knowing your rights, on your own turf.
Okay, so let's paint the picture for you. Imagine this. A guy in Longview, Texas. He's just moved his pickup truck. Simple maneuver, pulling it from one side of his driveway over to the other. He stays completely inside the lines of his own property. No public roads involved here, no traffic, just moving his vehicle, routine stuff. But then, boom, suddenly an officer is approaching him right there on his property. And the officer starts what he calls a traffic stop, claims the man was speeding, going 50 in a 40 zone, right there in his own driveway. And immediately the officer is demanding ID and proof of insurance. Now that right there brings up a huge initial question, doesn't it? What legal ground does an officer even have to start a traffic stop for something that supposedly happened entirely on private property?
Right. And this is where the legal analysis gets really illuminating. The first big takeaway here, right off the bat, is about the legal basis for entry and stop on private property. See, our source material highlights a really critical legal point. Under Texas law, generally, officers can't just initiate a traffic stop on private property unless they actually witness a crime happening right then and there, or they have some other clear, lawful reason to be on that property, like a warrant, an alleged traffic infraction, like speeding in your own driveway. That usually doesn't cut it. It doesn't typically provide sufficient legal grounds for that stop. And in this specific case, remember, the man was already parked on his property when the officer came up. Plus, the source notes there was no dash cam footage, no evidence mentioned to back up that speeding claim. So to answer your question, the analysis strongly suggests the officer probably lacked lawful grounds to even stop or detain the man on his private property for that alleged speeding. That's kind of your first line of defense, understanding the rules change on your property.
Okay, so from the get-go, the legal footing for the officer here is, well, shaky, according to the source. Now, as things unfold, the man tries to explain the situation. He tells the officer his ex-wife is coming to pick up their child, and he points out the officer is now blocking his driveway, calling it unreasonable. He also specifically asks the officer, do you have a warrant? He's definitely asserting his property rights there. And despite the officer blocking him in, the man does show his ID. He holds it up, makes it visible. But when the officer demands he physically hand it over, the man refuses firmly. He says something like, you ain't handing you crap, I have to present it according to state law. Present, that's it. Then he tells the officer point blank, don't get off my property, and you're not welcome here. That's a pretty bold assertion of his boundary.
It is. And that whole exchange, it highlights another absolutely vital legal detail our source material emphasizes. It's this distinction between presenting versus handing over documents. This confuses a lot of people. Our source clarifies that under Texas law, specifically during what would be a valid traffic stop, a driver does have to show their ID and insurance. But, and this is the really crucial part for you to remember on your private property, they're not typically obligated to physically hand them over. Not unless there's a specific law or maybe a court order that says they must, just holding the documents up so the officer can read them. That satisfies the legal requirement in many situations like this. The man in this video, he clearly understood that nuance and his refusal to hand it over. Well, according to the analysis, that was likely within his rights on his own property. It really speaks to a basic principle, right? You don't have to give up more control, more of your stuff than the law actually requires.
Right. It sounds like he knew that specific point very well. But things don't calm down there, unfortunately. Even after the man shows his ID and the officer actually writes a citation, Things take a really sharp turn. As the man just tries to go back into his house, simply walking towards his own door, the officer physically arrests him, aggressively, right there in front of his daughter. And the claim, evading. It's just a shocking escalation from his supposed driveway speeding ticket.
Yeah, and the man, he's obviously upset, but seems to be trying to stay composed. He keeps asking, "What am I being arrested for?" He states clearly, "I don't consent to your seizures on my property or person," and even tells the officer, "Don't touch me." Meanwhile, the officer calls for backup. On the radio, he calls the man erratic and suggests he might not even sign the ticket. It almost sounds like he's trying to build a case for the escalation after the fact.
And this brings us to a really critical point about understanding unlawful arrests, especially this evading charge. Now, typically, when an officer claims someone is evading or evading arrest, they mean the person is actively running away, physically resisting, trying to escape a lawful detention or arrest. But our source material meticulously breaks down why that just doesn't seem to fit this situation, and why the analysis calls this arrest excessive and unlawful. The reasoning provided is pretty straightforward. The source's interpretation of the law suggests you can't arrest someone for evading after they've already complied, presented their documents, received a citation, and especially when they're just peacefully walking back into their own house. At that point, there's no act of flight, no resistance to a lawful order happening. The source sees this as a complete disregard for constitutional protections, specifically, the Fourth Amendment, which guards against unreasonable searches and seizures. It protects you from the government just arbitrarily interfering in your private life and property.
Wow. So the whole basis for that evading charge seems, based on this analysis, extremely questionable, maybe even invalid. And it doesn't even end there. The situation gets even more intense. The man's taken into custody. Then when his ex-wife arrives, officers start questioning her, still, as our source puts it, just fishing for information with no cause. They're asking for her ex-husband's name, asking if he lives there, asking about the daughter being present. They even mention calling Child Protective Services, CPS. Even though the ex-wife confirmed the child's grandfather was right there with her, it really feels like intimidation at that point.
It absolutely does feel that way, and that's exactly how the analysis frames it. It moves beyond simple law enforcement into intimidation and disregard for rights. Our source doesn't describe this continued questioning as a legitimate investigation. It uses terms like intimidation, ego, and a complete disregard for constitutional protections. This ongoing, harassment, questioning the ex-wife without apparent cause, bringing up CPS seemingly without any real concern for the child's safety. It just shows how far things escalated beyond any possible initial legal justification. And it really underscores the importance of the right to refuse consent. Refusing consent to searches of your property, your person. Declining to answer questions that aren't relevant to a lawful interaction. Just know you don't have to consent or answer those kinds of fishing questions unless legally required. That's a powerful piece of knowledge in these incredibly stressful moments.
Wow. Yeah, it really paints a stark picture of how fast things can spin out of control when those initial legal lines are, according to our source, crossed. So, okay, let's boil this down. What does this all mean for you, the listener? What are the key takeaways? The practical nuggets of knowledge you can pull from this deep dive into an encounter on private property. How can you maybe apply this understanding if, heaven forbid, you find yourself in a similar spot?
Okay, yeah, let's distill it. Drawing directly from our source material and looking at this specific incident, here are the crucial things to remember about police interactions specifically on your private property. First, understand the legal basis for entry and stop. It's different than a public road. Big difference. On your private property, the bar for a lawful stop or detention is much higher. Officers generally can't just initiate a traffic stop or detain you unless they directly see a crime happening, or they already have a clear legal reason to be there, like that warrant we mentioned. An alleged traffic violation that happened only on your private property. That might not be enough for a lawful stop. Remember that. Second, remember the presenting versus handing over documents difference. In Texas, as our source clarifies, you might only be required to show your ID and insurance. Hold it up so they can read it. You're generally not obligated to physically hand those documents over unless a specific law or court order says you must. It keeps some control in your hands. Third, assert your right to refuse consent. This is huge. You have the right to say no to searches of your property or your person. You also have the right to decline answering questions that aren't directly relevant to a lawful interaction. No need to answer fishing expeditions. You don't have to explain why you're refusing. Just be polite but firm. I do not consent. And finally, number 4, understand unlawful arrest, particularly around charges like evading. Our source really highlights this. An arrest for evading after you've already complied with showing documents or getting a ticket can be unlawful. especially if you're just peacefully trying to go back into your own house. Legally, evading usually means actively fleeing from a lawful detention, just walking away after the interaction seems over. That's likely not it.
Right. And it is just absolutely critical we hammer this point home one more time. As we've stressed throughout this whole deep dive, these specific rules, these legal points, the responses we've discussed, they pertain almost exclusively to interactions happening on private property. Your land, your driveway, your yard, the whole legal landscape, the expectations, your rights. They change significantly once you're on a public road, or even in a public space, or maybe a common area of an apartment complex. The nuances we explore today, they're specifically about protecting your space when you are on your own ground. Wow. What an eye-opening deep dive, really, into the complex details of law enforcement interaction on private property. This situation, I mean, our source calls it a textbook example of how authority can be abused when citizens don't bow to unlawful demands.
Yeah.
It really just underlines how important being inframed is.
It does. And it brings up, I think, an important question for you, the listener, to think about. While knowing your rights on your own property is, without a doubt, empowering, these real-world situations, like the one we looked at, they can be incredibly high stress, very emotionally charged. So how do you balance asserting your specific legal rights with navigating that escalating human dynamic, all while you're potentially under serious duress? It's a really challenging balance to strike in the moment.
Indeed it is. It's definitely a complex area. But being well informed, knowing the specifics of the law, especially when it concerns your own home, your own property, that is unequivocally your first and probably your most powerful step. Knowledge really is your best defense in these kinds of surprising and sometimes, yeah, unsettling situations. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into these really critical facts and important distinctions.